Welcome to another edition of Yorkton Stories, where we take a look at Yorkton's past and present in conversations with people involved in the topic we're exploring or those who are very familiar with it. There are many interesting stories in the minds of Yorkton people, and we like nothing more than to tap into those. My name is Dick DeRike. This podcast is largely a labor of love, but we are grateful for the support of Harvest Meats and Grain Millers Canada, both here in Yorkton, and others who help out or listen to our stories. You can hear our podcasts on our website, yorktonstories.ca, where you will also find photos, links, and other information associated with each podcast when available. In many cases, you can not only hear the stories, you can also see and read information about the podcast topics. We can also be found on all major podcast directories, including Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, TuneIn and Alexa, and iHeartRadio. Search for Yorkton Stories, and you will find us. There is a tendency to think of co-ops and the cooperative movement as a Western Canadian or Canadian prairie phenomenon. Not so. Agricultural co-ops have certainly been dominant on the prairies. The wheat pools and United Grain Growers elevators dominated the skyline for decades. But co-ops were founded in Europe in the early 1800s as an alternative to industrialization, which was led by large corporate interests. The cooperatives, on the other hand, were owned and operated by their members. The principles of co-ops were defined in Britain in 1844. Members in a cooperative each had one vote, regardless of the investment made. Anyone could join. Surpluses or profits were distributed to members according to their level of participation, and cooperatives would undertake educational activities for their members. The first cooperatives in North America were formed, somewhat unsuccessfully, by British laborers in Boston in the 1840s. And in 1861, the first co-op in Canada was formed by miners in Stullerton, Nova Scotia. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, when the West was being settled, cooperative utopian communities were established with varying degrees of success. Among them was Kennington Manor, south of Wabota, Saskatchewan, and the Bar Colony, where Lloydminster is now located on the Saskatchewan-Alberta border. Farmers in Canada were the first to successfully develop co-ops, led by dairy farmers in Quebec, Ontario, and the Maritimes in the late 1800s. Prairie farmers organized the Grain Growers Grain Company in 1906 to market directly to millers, and in 1911, Saskatchewan farmers organized the Saskatchewan Co-operative Elevator Company. Alberta farmers did the same 2 years later. Other Canadian farm groups, fruit growers, livestock producers, and tobacco farmers soon did the same. More so-called cooperative pooling followed, and in 1923 and 1924, prairie grain growers organized the wheat pools. Then came a wave of other co-ops, retail stores, credit unions, housing, arts and crafts, health facilities, commercial fishing, petroleum producers among them. There are now about 5,500 co-ops in Canada, the largest of which is Federated Co-op in Saskatoon, which provides goods and services to more than 160 member retail co-ops across Western Canada. Brazil has the most co-ops of any country in the world, followed closely by Norway, Uruguay, and Canada. Well down the list is Cambodia, a country of 17 million in Southeast Asia, sandwiched between Vietnam to the east and Thailand to the west, with Laos bordering it to the north. 80% of the population of Cambodia lives in rural areas, and 57% of households in the country are involved in agricultural production, mainly rice. It is a poverty-stricken country and a long way from Yorkton. But in 2010 and again in 2015, Warren Crossman, who farms in the Orcadia district and is a longtime activist in the cooperative movement in Saskatchewan, spent time there, first as an advisor to Farmer and Nature Net, a nonprofit and non-political farmer organization representing a network of village-based farmer organizations. It is an umbrella serving the interests of self-help associations, agricultural cooperatives, and providing assistance with capacity building. Most members of FNN, Farmer and Nature Net, are subsistence farmers who are poor and living in rural communities. He went back in 2015 on a private visit for reasons we will hear about from him. It wasn't Warren's first work overseas, that Cambodia visit in 2010, but it is one that made a lasting impression on him. He was a field man with the Saskatchewan wheat pool from 1976 to 2001, when he left the wheat pool to become the Saskatchewan manager of the Canadian Cooperative Association, and then manager of the Saskatchewan Cooperative Association 2 years later, when it became its own co-op, thanks in large part to his leadership. In August of 2000, he spent time in China to assist the Canadian Cooperative Association microfinance program for women in the remote western region of Xinjiang, more recently in the news because of China's persecution of the Uyghur or Muslim population. This program, started in the 1990s, allowed women to borrow money to start a business, and when the loan was repaid, they were eligible to borrow more. In a male-dominated society, the program was accepted by men because it provided a means for women to support the family, Warren says. And to everyone's amazement, it was allowed by the Chinese government. Early in 2000, he was also in the Philippines on a cooperative education study tour with other Canadians, and his interest in food security issues had also taken him to Kenya and Ethiopia in Africa in early 1999 with the Canadian Food Grains Bank. In 2001, Warren received a Global Citizen Award from the Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation in recognition for an outstanding contribution to equality and justice in international development and cooperation. He retired from the Saskatchewan Cooperative Association in 2008, when he and his wife Kathy returned as the third generation on the farm of her father, Tom Wood. That farm in the Orcadia area was first established in 1897 and taken over by Kathy's grandparents, Alice and Ernie Wood, in 1907. Then came the call from the Canadian Cooperative Association, asking if he would go to Cambodia to help there. Your first exposure to cooperatives was the Saskatchewan wheat pool.
Big time.
And that goes back to 1976. And you've been in co-ops ever since, in various capacities.
And yes. Like with the wheat pool, it wasn't a matter of developing cooperatives. Yes, we worked with the provincial government, Department of Cooperation, yeah, but we were field staff. We worked with the democratic side of the organization, which was all about governance and policy. Yeah. So it was always about meeting with members, committees, like annual meetings, committee meetings, all that stuff.
In the corporate world, there's big business, which is controlled elsewhere by and large, and there's co-ops, which is at a local level. What attracted you to co-ops, versus getting into business?
Well, I don't think it was probably the cooperative aspect of it initially. What it was the idea that ever since I was in probably grade 8, so I would be 13 years old, I wanted to get into agriculture. And it seemed to me that when the wheat pool offered an opportunity to get into agriculture, that was something that I thought I could do. And I really didn't know too much about the field staff, but I thought this is a good way to get involved in agriculture.
But you're a city slicker. You're a city boy. Grew up in Saskatoon. Played with your buddies along the South Saskatchewan River. How does a Saskatoon city boy get interested in agriculture?
Well, I think it was because I went to the University of Saskatchewan and was in the College of Agriculture. And it was because of that that I got more interested even in agriculture, even though I went and got a diploma in chemical technology. It was on my horizon. I guess the wheat pool was there. And it didn't hurt that my father-in-law was a wheat pool delegate, I believe, at that time. So I got a bit of information from him. And when my wife and I got married, at the wedding service, there was a field man who was from Yorkton. And engaging with him, I got to know him, and I guess it was partly through that as well. So there was not one little thing, it was a number of things. Plus, I liked the idea of adult education. So it all fit together.
So you ended up in the co-ops. Wheat pool at that time was a co-op. It obviously went a different route later.
Yeah, it was most of the time that I was an employee of the wheat pool. I was always on the field staff, nowhere else. It was the biggest business in Saskatchewan. That was Saskatchewan based. And it was, I believe, the biggest cooperative in Canada.
You probably had, at one time or another, opportunities to do other stuff. Did you develop personal philosophy that matched what the co-ops were doing?
I think so. But it started out really by building relationships. And that relationship building meant that my coworkers, whether they were elevator managers or other employees of the cooperative, it was about that relationship. But it was also about the hundreds of meetings that I would go to, which was working with farmers. And these were all members, so it could have been on a wheat pool committee because that was a year-round type of thing. So it was building relationships with farmers that lived on farms that I would visit. That was part of the job. In addition to all these meetings, we would go and meet with farmers and talk about what their issues were and encourage them and help them to bring their ideas forward through the wheat pool system so that it got to the board of directors. And if the board and management needed to do things on behalf of farmers of Saskatchewan, they would do that. And it was legitimate and it was genuine and it worked. And that's what caught my attention. Grassroots and the wheat pool was for real. Always in the back of my mind, the vision that the original contract signers of the wheat pool had going back to 1924 was being realized by the current day Saskatchewan wheat pool when I was involved with the wheat pool.
In the 70s and 80s?
70s, 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s.
And then it changed, of course.
It did. It changed. And I don't believe that what was happening to the wheat pool would have been something that the original contract signers of the wheat pool would have wanted. And part of that learning came from the early field staff people that I met when I started with the wheat pool in 76, who knew the original contract signers of the wheat pool. And what I learned from these older, getting ready to retire field staff was about what the wheat pool meant to them and what it meant to farmers.
You ended up with the Saskatchewan Co-operative Association.
I was the founding executive director.
Founding executive director. And that encompasses all the co-ops in Saskatchewan.
Pretty much. The main ones at that time included Federated Cooperative, Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, and there were a number of others. Yeah. So they were the members. They paid member dues and so on. And just as a bit of an example, we would promote cooperatives. Yes, that was part of our responsibility as a small community service cooperative. But we were responsible for the cooperative youth program, which meant that all cooperatives in the province supported and sponsored teams to go to one of the cooperative youth camps or seminars that were held. So that sort of took me back again to the wheat pool because the wheat pool had started that in 1929.
After you retired from Saskatchewan Cooperatives Association, and you moved to your wife's family farm just outside of Yorkton. She's from here originally. You got a phone call and you were invited to participate in working with co-ops in Cambodia, of all places. We don't think of Cambodia or Southeast Asia. It's hard to think of that as kind of a cooperative hotbed. But there's a lot of co-ops in that area of the world.
I was asked by the Canadian Cooperative Association in 2009 to go to Cambodia in 2010. And basically, I agreed to that, and I went by myself. But the Canadian Cooperative Association was supporting an organization called FNN, Farmer and Nature Net. And Farmer and Nature Net was an NGO or non-government organization that was helping set up and helping cooperatives that were rural-based. Nothing to do with the cities. It was totally rural-based because rice production in Cambodia is the major industry of the whole country. So agriculture from a rice production perspective is really important. So I was asked to go to Cambodia to be an advisor to Farmer and Nature Net. And Farmer and Nature Net had several employees. And so it was to provide counsel to FNN to support the work that they were doing that was supporting cooperatives. I did not do any other work on cooperatives other than through FNN.
Even here now, when we look at cooperatives, they operate like business pretty much. Is that the same in Cambodia, or is it much more personal, much closer to the ground?
All cooperatives around the world operate by the co-op principles. So cooperative principles are global. However, every cooperative is different in the sense that, some are cities, some are rural, some are dealing with agricultural kinds of things, and some are dealing with technology. So they cover all aspects really of the Canadian economy, depending on the cooperative. But when I went to Cambodia, it was totally rural. That was the only part of cooperatives that I associated myself with because I was part of FNN's advisory group. It was agricultural people in the rural areas of Cambodia throughout the country, and their sole purpose at that time, and it may have changed now, but when I was there, it was all about growing rice. The problem with growing rice back in those days is, and it's the same principle in a way as to the start of organizations like the Wheat Pool, people were being taken advantage of as farmers back in the Wheat Pool days, and there was not a lot of competition. In Cambodia, it was somewhat similar in the sense that farmers would grow rice as they always had. But they didn't have a good market for their produce. And they needed to have an organization that would help them market their grain. And so that they could actually increase the amount of money that they could put in their pocket as individual farmers, rice producers. And so that was what FNN was all about at that time.
So they were cooperatives of basically individual families or individuals who were doing rice farming.
Yes, and therein lies a bit of the problem. Even though a lot of the rice was sold at prices that were under market value, and they were sold by middlemen to places like Vietnam and other countries, these farmers really had no power in the marketplace. They were just people who were forced to work and accept a pittance for all their work. Yeah. And this included men and women. And so the idea was that cooperatives, if they were being organized on behalf of farmers, then they could have a presence in the marketplace, really to look out for the interests of these rice producers, and eventually have a cooperative marketing system that would increase the returns from producing rice in the country. And that's what happened. The biggest problem, actually, for FNN, and at that time, and this is where I was kind of involved, is that a lot of time these rice producers, they want to produce rice. That's their main focus. They're farmers. That's what they want to do, produce. The problem is, if you have a cooperative, the members must be the farmers. Okay, that's not a problem. But in any cooperative, you need perhaps directors and perhaps other groups involved, and these have to be members of the cooperative. Well, in Cambodia, these farmer members, they were so busy running their own little rice growing operation, they didn't have a lot of time, if the interest at all, to get involved with an organization, cooperative or not. And that was probably the biggest challenge, is to get them involved in their own organization so they could run it instead of somebody else doing it for them and trying to market their product.
Yeah. So was it only on the selling side that the co-op would be active, or would they be active on the buying side as well, by buying groups and bulk buying, that kind of stuff? Did that happen?
No, there was a couple of other organizations that were actually helping farmers, but it wasn't Farmer and Nature Net, FNN. But these organizations kind of worked side by side. And so they helped as cooperatives. They would help one another as cooperatives. But the role of FNN at that time was to get farmers more directly involved. But again, there were other cooperatives that were very empathetic to FNN and the role. So and there was a little bit of even overlap in terms of human resources too. So they worked really, really good. And the one organization that comes to mind is an organization that was very big called CEDAC, CEDAC. Can't remember what it stands for now, but CEDAC. And I'm not sure it's continuing as it was back then, but it was very big.
Has it been a success? Do you know?
Well, we keep in touch a little bit, but it's always difficult because of language. Even though some people did speak English, it's a little bit more difficult. Was it a success? I think it was. Was it the success that they had originally, looked at when I was there? I'm not sure. That's a good question, but I'm really not sure. Part of my role was advising how to not set up cooperatives so much. So it wasn't about cooperative development, but it was trying to help the leaders of FNN to sort of how to approach farmers, even though I didn't know the farmers. I mean, I met with many different groups, but it was all through an interpreter, of course. But it was to try to get them to support their cooperative. But I think that they are very, very happy with the results that they've got, even though the organization probably has evolved as an NGO working with cooperative rice co-ops. I think they've been successful. What I'm telling you mainly was in 2010. What happened? I was supposed to be there for 3 months, but I got a phone call after 2 months. I got a phone call from my brother in Saskatoon at 6 o'clock in the morning. I answered the phone, and he said that our dad had died. I was shocked, and I literally fell to the floor. And so I made arrangements. I didn't know what to do, but for the benefit of my mom and to support her, I decided that I guess I better come home. I wanted to go back to Cambodia. I wanted to sort of continue on with what I was doing. So in October of 2015, I had saved up the money to go back. Unfortunately, the Canadian Cooperative Association were no longer supporting FNN with money, so because the project had ended. I went back to Cambodia in 2015 and stayed for 3 months. I said to my colleagues, former associates, I had families that I lived with, because I didn't stay in a hotel. That wasn't me. I lived with Cambodians. And 99.9% of the people that I talked to, met with, they were all Cambodians. And I got to know them. As I was told, I was as much a Cambodian as any foreigner can be.
That's a compliment.
It is. It really is. My role the second time back was very minor with FNN. I did a little bit with them, but because the project was over, I asked my colleagues and FNN people, SEDAC people, and all the people that I knew, because it was a lot. I said, I'm here on my own. Nobody's telling me what I should do. If you want, I will do anything within my limited skill set, anywhere in this country, as long as I can get there. I will do whatever I can to help this country in whatever way you want me to help. Well, Cambodia has 25 different provinces. I was in 22 of them and doing different things. Most of it was cultural. So I would be asked to help different NGOs with different things unrelated to cooperatives. They wanted to know about Canada. They wanted to know about the West. They wanted to know about a lot of things. And one of the things that I learned when I went back to Cambodia the second time, a new political party had started. And about 5 or 6 months before I got there, and I had no idea, wasn't interested. But I was asked if I would put on a workshop for the leaders of this political party that had just started, because they wanted to mount a campaign against the current government. And so I said, well, okay, I can do that. But I was very, very, very cautious because of the political environment in Cambodia, because the ruler of Cambodia, who was the prime minister, because it is a democracy, he had all the seats in the parliament. And so I knew that this new party didn't stand a chance of really getting elected. But I said, sure. So I put on a workshop, and about 15 of these leaders came in. So I was doing things like that. But it was all cultural, not political, but I met with churches, and I even led a part of a church service through an interpreter, asked to give prayers, and the list is endless of what I did. And sometimes it was just going and meeting, like an employee of FNN asked if I could go to her hometown and meet with the people of that village. So on a weekend, we went. And I spent the weekend with villagers talking about the cultures that exist in Canada. And so we compared notes, and I did many, many, many meetings like that. So it was more of a cultural thing.
In the rural areas, at least, is it more family oriented, perhaps?
Yes, it's highly family oriented. It's community based, and people look out for one another. They don't all have vehicles like we have here, say in Canada, but they do have means of transportation, which could be by bicycle or some other non-motorized vehicles. But there's a huge disparity in terms of income. There's extremely poor people, extremely poor in the city, like Phnom Penh, the capital, and the rural areas. Having said that, when I say there's a huge discrepancy, there's people that have made money off of the people, basically, that are super rich. For example, the only time I've ever seen a Rolls Royce in my life, I've never seen one except I saw one or two in Cambodia. I'm never in Canada. They're really family oriented and looking out for their community.
Do you keep in touch?
I keep in touch with one person who is kind of like a non-biological family. And the person is, he's in his 40s, and I stayed with him mainly on the weekends when I was back in Phnom Penh. That's where he lived. And I lived with him the second time I went, and we've become good friends, and we keep in touch. It turns out that he was hired, the first time I went to Cambodia, he was hired, and I was part of the hiring process for an interpreter. And so that's how I got to know him. We became very good friends. So we are in touch. There's a couple of other people that I keep in touch with. For example, my wife and I started something called peace offerings. And so instead of maybe flying back and spending thousands of dollars on airfare to get to and from Cambodia, we have, through my non-biological family, through Sun Kim is his name, he has found people who in rural areas have nothing. And they have no access to food and maybe no shelter, and medicine is a problem. And these are people who the government, they don't care about. They don't help. And even foreign aid agencies who are big and do wonderful work, they want to help hundreds, thousands of people. And so what we've been doing is helping one person at a time. So for example, San Kim had, when we started this, he was going along the highway and stopped at a public washroom, which they have along the highways. And while he was there, he noticed there was some bushes right beside the toilets. He went around there, and here's an elderly woman. She was in her 80s. She's living there with nothing, just beside the outhouse. And so those are the type of people we've been helping ever since that time. And there's been a few glitches along the way, but we've helped. And one of the groups we helped have gotten better was a school. We helped a school here a few years ago. And believe it or not, in the early part of December, I was asked if I would buy a Christmas tree for this church. And I said, absolutely. And it was really cheap, but got it shipped from Phnom Penh, about 3 hours north of this little wee community to help the church. They don't have any money, but this little tree, I was absolutely delighted. And I got a picture of it.
It's like our Christmas tree?
Yep.
Are there
Yep.
evergreen trees
Yep.
there? Yeah.
Most people in Cambodia are not Christian. I think there's maybe 4 or 5% of the people are Christian, but this happens to be a Christian church.
Yeah.
And so they're Cambodian Christians. And so we, it doesn't matter if you're in Canada or Cambodia, God is still the same God.
Yeah. Is there a way for people in Canada or Yorkton and an area to support that kind of work that you're doing, or are you doing it privately?
It's private. We have never solicited any money from anybody. And that's probably just as well, because then that way we don't have to be accountable to others. We can do this in ways that make sense, and we don't have sort of a third party involved. So the money is limited, but sometimes it's best to support a local charity that you believe in, whether it's in Yorkton or an international one, and donate money to them. So I do support that. But this is just something that my wife and I do just to support families as best we can.
One at a time.
One at a time, the most destitute people of all.
Quite amazing.
Because of the relationships that I built with so many different people in Cambodia and seeing the disparity in terms of income, because there is wealth there, but there's so much poverty as well. So we're helping those folks that are poor. And I stayed with many, many, many different families. I went away on weekends with people that wanted to take me to wherever. But what I did too is I did buy some Khmer. Khmer is the language they speak in Cambodia. I bought Bibles and distributed them to churches that didn't have Bibles and so on. But I did a whole range of other things out in some of these rural areas. And there are stories in themselves that make my time in Cambodia go well beyond the work that I did in 2010 with cooperatives.
What is their level of interest in Canada? I don't know how well Canada is known there. The United States is probably better known. Are people interested in Canada just for interest's sake? Or is there an interest in moving, emigrating?
Well, just to backtrack a little bit, there's a huge interest in Cambodia by the Chinese. And the Chinese are, using the termite strategy to become more and more involved in Cambodia. Now, United States historically, because of the war in Vietnam, have had an interest in Cambodia, and I was led to some sites in which military bombs had exploded in Cambodia, and yet Cambodians were not in the war. Yeah. Right now, there's a friction between the United States and Cambodia, but the American currency is the de facto currency. So they actually have two currencies in Cambodia. One is the American dollar, and the other one is the Cambodian currency. They know quite a bit about the United States, yes. They know very little about Canada because there's not too many. There's a few tourists that go there, but a lot of tourists will go to Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos, but they don't necessarily talk to local people. Just to give you an example, the first time I was there, I stayed in this little residence. It had a little restaurant out front. There was a couple there, and I don't know what country they were from, but I think it was the United States. And I went over to them. They were sitting there, and they looked bored. So I went over and said, hi. And they spoke English. And I said, are you enjoying your time here in Cambodia? And they said, well, they shrugged their shoulders. Yeah. But then they explained that they were all in these different countries, and they were only in Cambodia for a short time. So I said, have you talked to any of the local Cambodian people? No, we're not here for that long. And I said, oh, okay. So I asked them, I said, would you like to learn one word? And they said, well, what? What is it? And I said, the word is okun. And they said, what? I said, okun. And then of course, they wanted to know what that meant. And I said, okun in Khmer language means thank you. So I said, if you're coming up to any Cambodian people, just say okun for something they may have done for you and see what happens. And I never talked to these people again, but I do know if you know a few words in the language, any country, but in this case, Cambodia, it opened up doors. And they were very, very positive doors. They do not know too much about Canada. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I was in Cambodia, they wanted to know more about the country of Canada because they didn't know anything. One thing I did learn initially was they thought everybody spoke French. Southeast Asia was part of the French Indochina Empire up until about 1952, 53. But there still is a heavy French influence. And so some people might have connected Canada with French-speaking people, and that's about it. The second time I went to Cambodia, I heard that they were going to open up, Canada was going to open up a trade office of some sort in Cambodia because the nearest trade office was in Bangkok, where the embassy is and so on. So I tried to find out because I heard that there was going to be an official opening in December. I thought, I'm going to be there, and maybe I could attend. I didn't know. Anyway, I couldn't get any information from anybody that might know. And so I gave up on that. So it turned out that I was in southern part of Cambodia in a province and a city that I had been invited to. And I went with a colleague. And the colleague introduced me to her family. They said, let's go up sort of on this mountain area where it's a resort. And I said, really, you want to go there? And they said, yeah, we want to go. And I said, why? Well, they're going to have pizza. And I said, what? I said, you want to go and have pizza? And they said, yes. And I think it was because of me. And I said, well, I can go with you and I can tell you if it's legitimate pizza or not. And so we went. They had vehicles. We went. There was probably about 15 of us. Got to this resort, and yeah, apparently it was American owned. I didn't see any American there, but that's what they told me. And so we ordered pizza about 4:00 that afternoon and waited. And there was a pool right there, and there was a family there. And I heard the guy yell at the dog that jumped into the swimming pool. He wasn't Cambodian, so I thought, well, he sort of spoke English, but it was not English that I was familiar with, but it was English. Anyway, I went over to him. I said, if you don't mind me asking, what country are you from? He said, well, I've lived in Cambodia for 15 years with my family, and this is my family, you see, but I'm from Quebec. And I said, oh, and so it turns out he was an employee of working with the Canadian government, with the embassy to Thailand. I said, really? I said, well, I heard that there was an official opening of this trade office or whatever in Cambodia and in Phnom Penh. And he said, yeah, you want to come? Because he was involved with it. And I couldn't believe the coincidence. So it turned out following Monday, I did go and I participated in the official inauguration, I guess, of the Cambodian-Canada reception. I was there for that and had an interesting conversation with the Canadian ambassador to, Cambodia, but Thailand. And so we exchanged greetings, and he knew all about what I was doing there. Again, one thing leads to another.
And how was the pizza?
Well, what happened with the pizza, very short story, we waited, and it gets dark, I believe, around 6 to 6:30 in Cambodia. And so it was starting to get dark, and we still hadn't got the pizza. We waited an hour and a half, 2 hours. And one of our group, one of the guys said, we got to go back to Campo. I was saying, well, why? He said, well, when it gets dark, the road we're going to go back on, it was robbed by bandits a few days ago. And if we don't go during the daylight, we could get robbed again on our way back. And so that speeded up the pizza process. We got our pizza and we took off with the pizza. It was just getting dark. We went into Campo, went to a restaurant, and took the pizza out and ate this pizza in a restaurant. It was just like regular pizza we would, enjoy in Canada.
Yeah. Watch for and listen to another podcast in about 3 weeks. Visit yorktonstories.ca to hear this and all previous podcasts. And there you can also sign up for our email list so we can let you know when a new episode is available. Thanks again to Harvest Meats and Grain Millers Canada, both here in Yorkton. And thank you for listening. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Get in touch through our website or by emailing Dick, D-I-C-K, at yorktonstories.ca. Hope to talk to you again soon.